Hello and welcome to our Compare and Contrast party. We're looking at Marsano strategies, and number one is similarities and differences, and in particular 1A is to compare and contrast. It can be said that there are two types of compare and contrast activities. There's the formal and the informal. The formal is written down, and that could be either on the board or on paper, and the informal is just spoken. And we have determined that both are good. If we have the formal, you have this visual, and it also helps children practice writing. But also the informal, we can just do that so often. So I'm going to give you two ways that I have found help you to get better quality answers from your students. First, let's use the words significant and trivial when we're talking about our examples. Define significant as important to this discussion, and trivial is not important to this discussion. And I want to encourage you to use these at every grade. I mean, every word is new to kindergartners, so they can learn significant and trivial very easily. And then remind them that trivial still means true. It's just not important to this discussion. So like they may want to say, well, the character was a girl. And our question would be yes, but is that significant or trivial to the story or to the discussion? And this asks kids to evaluate, which is, one of those higher order thinking skills. And it's going to help us reduce the number of trivial comparisons. And the second thing we can do to get better answers, higher quality answers, is to use a word bank. And so in this word bank, you can just use words that you want them to use and kind of limit which words they're going to use. And then you can say, okay, here are these words, and use at least one in every similarity or difference that you note. And this will significantly reduce the amount of trivial comparisons. But the problem is it doesn't really help in independent thinking, so you could do this for scaffolding or especially on assessments when you're looking for very particular answers. All right, so when's a good time to compare and contrast? Well, I'm going to give you 7 of the very top best times to compare and contrast. First of all, when students get two things confused with one another. This is like the best. If they're confused, slap down a Venn diagram and start comparing and contrasting. There's something very powerful about having the two things that kids are confused about right in front of their face at the same time, and you're helping them to delineate between the two by pointing out the similarities and differences. If a student has made a mistake, especially in a math problem, this would be a great place to show the real process, show what they did, and they could compare and contrast. Second great place is when you have two or more subgroups under the same classification. So if we're talking about body systems, we might compare these two specific body systems. When you have opposites, and this is classic, we've done this forever. And here's a great place when we're using these text to text, text to self, text to world references. It'd be a great place to use a Venn and really to write down and delineate these differences. The fifth place would be a great place to use a Venn or comparing and contrasting is when you're doing a skill differently than the way you did it before. Maybe we're expanding it and we're learning something new. And so this would be a great place to do a Venn. This helps the kids to make a connection with what they did before, and it helps them to show how we're just extending, especially in math. I think when we change processes and we don't help them connect it back to the way we did something before, then they feel like we're changing the rules on them. We're changing in midstream. And you can use generic similarities and differences, but also use specific examples. The sixth great place is when you're doing character analysis. If we wanted to analyze Laura Ingalls Wilder, we could compare and contrast her to Sarah Plain and Tall, or Amelia Bedelia to Mr. Magoo. That could be a little history there. Or Anne Frank to the student themselves. And if you use pop culture references or ask them to compare to themselves, this ups the engagement. And finally, the last great place is when you have two very disparate objects or ideas that you wouldn't necessarily compare. And you may even say that these ideas have no basis for comparison, but it's a great exercise, especially for your kids, that are creative or have the capability of some higher order thinking. You also find out when you ask these kinds of questions what the kids truly know about the content piece. This last one was some ordinary object in a basket on the desk. You might have 5 or 6 objects in there, maybe scissors and a rock and some plastic toy and a key. And they have to choose one of those objects and then compare and contrast that object to Teddy Roosevelt. And again, you might give them 3 categories under which they need to find similarities and differences. All right, so what kind of structures should we use? Well, Venn is our default, and it's just easy to slap down on a piece of paper, but any kind of structure is fine. In fact, a variety is good for transfer. And then here's a little idea. How about the one-shot Venn, where you ask them to pick only one bullet in each of the same in both categories and the neither categories, and ask them to pick the most significant, and then discuss who found the most significant similarities and differences, or similarity and difference. And it kind of doesn't matter which one they've chosen, as much as the discussion is the important thing there. Another structure we might use is called the word splash. You put all the words that you want them to know and that they have been studying, and you can have these directions. You can write 2 sentences using that vocab about the Osage people. You can write 2 sentences using those words about the Iroquois, and then here comes the compare and contrast bit. Write two sentences about both the Osage and the Iroquois. Kids love word splashes. And this one's pretty creative and fun. They have 2 categories, 2 things that they're going to compare and contrast, and they can do an unusual smear campaign. This would be great for an election year, like the one I'm in right now. And so you give them the 2 categories, and you actually separate them into 2 groups. In this case, we'd have a fiction group and a nonfiction group. And they would have to act like they are actual living objects, and that they are backing them for some race, and they have to put good things, and of course they can say bad things about the other category too, because it's a smear campaign. It's kind of fun. All right, so here are 3 things that you can do to evaluate if you are using enough similarities and differences in your classroom. Are you asking your students to compare and contrast enough? One of the things is when you say compare and contrast, do your students just throw their hands up and already start telling you similarities and differences? Okay, that's a good sign that you're doing it enough. When you say compare and contrast on a piece of paper, do they automatically throw down a Venn or some other graphic organizer? And the final thing is, are you doing it at least once a week? Marsano tells us that there's like a 40% increase when we do similarities and differences, and that's on an achievement test. So, golly, that's well worth our time there. So at least once a week. And I thank you very much for listening.